looking at her bio, has more four-letter acronyms that she's involved in leading and guiding than I think anybody else I know. I always find her absolutely fascinating to listen to and to talk to. And she's got a great title for the morning after the conference dinner. So, Merike.
Good morning, everyone. And yeah, it was very interesting when Andrew asked me a year ago, literally it was June of last year, whether or not I'd give a keynote. I was asking, you know, do you mind, I mean, can I do it in the beginning of the week because I'm heading off to the ICANN meeting in Morocco? Well, he said, absolutely, no problem. And then what happened a couple months later was I was asked to do the keynote at TNC in Estonia. I'm Estonian. And so I pleaded and very kindly asked, can I do both? And he then slotted me today. And little did I know how appropriate the title would be, even for the day after the social. So waking up the guards. And it's kind of interesting as I see people trickling in, it really reminds me of security. I've been doing security for about 25 years, networking for 30. And you know, people have slowly trickled in and understood how important security is, right? And I think in the last 5 years, it's gotten a lot of global attention because things are just so bad. So my talk really is about looking at the fundamentals that really we should never lose sight of. And that deals with also protocols, right? Because the criminals and the nefarious actors are getting smarter and smarter in terms of how these protocols work together to stay under the radar. So in the beginning, right, 30 years ago, trust was inherent. And as I gave my talk in Estonia, I had looked through my archives, and I had done a small part when Estonia was first getting connected to the internet, and I have email archives of that. And I was looking through the old emails. I mean, I think one person here is Estonian who can read this. But basically what this email said was, you know, because I was helping them, said, you know, here's a couple of addresses where you can log into the devices. Because at times I was asked to log in to check whether or not they configured things correctly. And so it's interesting, right? This is an email. Like, here's username, here's password, it's guest. But oh, if you can't use this, then here's other credentials that you can use to get into the system. Now, this isn't just in Estonia, right? This was 1992, 1993. I was also on the Interop NOC team in 1991, 92, and I had met some people, and I was working for the National Institute of Health, where I got a phone call one day, and they're like, oh, you're Merike Kaeo, you got FTDI working on Cisco routers. I'm like, why, yes, I did. He goes, well, we ran into this problem. Would you mind logging into our routers? So he gave me the enable password. I logged in. I said, oh, yeah, you got to upgrade to this microcode. And then I'm like, well, what did I log into? This is 1992, the Apple backbone router. Okay, it was fine. I was like, ah, that's kind of cool. Right? And 2 years later, I met the guy who actually had phoned me. But I mean, the point that I'm trying to make, right, when we were first starting to do connectivity, the focus was on getting connectivity to work. Right? And when people say nobody thought about security, that's a fallacy, because you already had username, password, right? You had some basic access controls. You didn't have all of the nefarious activity. I mean, nobody would have ever thought how much crime and other nefarious activity is going on. So privacy and online safety wasn't yet a big concern, but you know, there was a little bit of thought there. Now roll into today, and we have a lot of blind trust issues, right? Protocol standards. Well, it's a protocol, it's a standard, right? I mean, it's gotta work correctly, right? But nobody takes into consideration is, well, what is the must, shoulds, and mays, right? How secure are they? If you have a must-use, you know, encryption algorithm that maybe has, you know, only 40-bit ciphers, I'm making this up right now, right? But you're like, well, it's a standard, so it's fine. And as an implementer, you're like, well, the standard says I can't implement it, so okay, I'm gonna do it. And then when you think about implementation guidelines, right? I was asked the other day, well, how do you deal with best practices? And I just kind of started laughing. I'm like, that's a really good question because there's so many to choose from, right? There are, and you know, what do we do with best practices that are online that are dated, right? And somebody new, like I get very annoyed when experts, tell newer folks that, oh, well, it's all online, just look at the best practice, right? Because I remember in the days a couple of years ago when you had a large issue with amplification attacks and open recursive DNS servers, right? And you're looking at the best practice documents for setting up an open recursive resolver. A lot of them, or recursive resolver, a lot of them have it in a mode where, you know, to set it up to be an open recursive resolver, right? How do you get rid of that online? I mean, it's okay to have managed open recursive resolvers, but not unmanaged ones. So there's a lot of implementation guidelines. Are they really good practices or not? But we trust them. Device certifications, right? This is also interesting because who actually created the criteria for device certifications and who's actually doing the sanity checking of that? Compliance mandates. I have a love-hate relationship with compliance. I mean, I see where they make sense because it really gives people a guideline for what do they need to pay attention to. But then for some folks, you know, it's a check mark. Yep, I'm compliant, I'm good. Well, we still have so many breaches, so I don't think you're good. Documented policies. Don't even get me started into that one. I've done so many security assessments, and I see policies, and this one always sticks up in my mind. I had a job quite a few years ago at in a large environment. And I was asked to be part of the policy team. So I took a look at their standards and, you know, I actually do read them and give comments. And there was one that I looked at and I said, wow, this is really interesting. Let me do some research, because it was a mobile environment. So I started looking at all of the mobile standards. Because what the policy, the encryption policy said that every equipment in this environment must support TLS with, AES 256-bit encryption, right, for TLS. That was in the company's mandate. And then when I looked at the actual mobile environment, there was one must-have algorithm for TLS, which was AES 192. So I went into the next meeting and I said, you do realize for all the equipment that's compliant with the standard, they're not compliant with our internal policy. And everyone went, oh, right? And I mean, I came into it late in the game, and there were already 15 people that were supposedly creating this policy. So I always wonder, like, who's actually paying attention to the policies? Do they even know what they're creating, right? And there's blind trust everywhere there. And then the human factor. Right? I mean, I do believe that people inherently want to do good, but we're human, so we do make mistakes. That's okay, right? I hate when somebody gets vilified for a mistake. If they do it again or don't care, fine, you know, then that's a problem. But otherwise, right, you can do and try to do everything right, but quite frankly, you'll still screw up somewhere, right? That's just life. And much bigger issue is organizational silos. Right? I mean, everybody loves to make fun of different teams like they don't get it. Well, of course they don't get it. They're not in your field. Right? And where we are today with security, we have to have cross-functional understanding. Right? The executive teams have to understand not the nerdy details, but absolutely the risks, right, in terms of what gets introduced if they make certain business decisions. Now, they're the ones that are liable, right? And so I'm okay if my recommendations, if I'm a CISO, I make a recommendation, and they decide for whatever reason that, okay, we'll accept this risk, right? Because they're liable, especially if they're trustees of a company, right? But, you know, I'd like to think that they're making at least an informed decision. And then legal departments, right? They have to understand, like, what is actually compliant. I mean, from the legal team, right, their job in a company is to make sure nobody goes to jail, right? And so, we're still all learning all over the place in the global environment. What does security mean? What does privacy mean? There's still a lot of work to do. And then with technical teams, right, you typically have research, architecture, operations. And this is what I'm going to touch upon later. We still have silos in terms of that's the DNS team, that's the routing team, that's the email team, you know, these are the application people, and what have you. And we need more cross-functional understanding of what's going on. Then government and policy is becoming more and more important because now you also have state actors getting involved in nefarious online activities, right? So, I mean, in the last 5 years, I'd say 10 years, right, really the government's moved from not a what-if statement, but, you know, when will something happen? And there's already been activities, right, that have been attributed to specific state actors, but what do you do about it, which is where cyber norms come into play. And I really liked the panel that there was this morning because they kind of touched upon some of the things that I'm going to talk about this morning. And then there's law enforcement, right? We're actually starting to put criminals in jail, right? Because cybercrime is crime, right? And that's something also that we always have to keep in mind, that the virtual world mimics the physical world, right? And the physical world is not perfect. There's still a lot of issues there. And so sometimes in the virtual world and with you know, online security, I see people always vilifying folks for not being perfect. Well, nobody is perfect. And we absolutely need to have this cross-functional education and understanding. I had a question a couple of days ago when I was at TNC, and they said, you know, you talk about not having backdoor encryption, so how do we get the government to understand this? And I said, reach out to them, right? Because if you're waiting for somebody to reach out to you, that's not the answer, right? It's also up to us to make the first move to help educate somebody that maybe is not as knowledgeable. And I had this just as a reminder because I wanted to talk about this. It was very fascinating to me when, with the Snowden revelations, everybody started to be on this bandwagon of let's encrypt everything. And I remember being at different conferences, and one time I just had to stand up and say, I'm not against encryption, right? I mean, cryptography gets used for integrity, which means that, you know, if I'm sending data to somebody, that you can be fairly certain that nobody's twiddled the bits in transit. It's also non-repudiation, that you can be fairly assured that it came from me. And then also the third thing is confidentiality. But everybody started talking about confidentiality. And then I started thinking about the fact that, you know, cryptography has consequences. I mean, how many of us have created numerous PGP keys because one that we created and haven't used, we forgot the secret passphrase to get at our secret keys, right? All of us have done this, especially if you've been around for 25 years or 30 years. And so it's really interesting because when you say encrypt everything, I'm like, well, have you really thought about the risks of how you do credential management and the fact that you can actually lose data and lose access to it if something happens where you lose how the credential that gives you access to that encrypted data, right? I've always been a proponent for 20 years, because this started with my, when I started working with IPsec, I care about using cryptography for integrity. I think every single piece of data should be integrity protected. Encryption, not so much, because you're also losing visibility of certain data. So you have to think about what is the impact of when you're actually using encryption. And we really have to think through the consequences for the future. So another example of cross-functional brokenness, right? So a protocol developer comes up with CSP, a cool security protocol, right? And typically in the standards bodies, right? I mean, they do think about different use cases, and a lot of times there's a lot of different options to handle every conceivable use case. The software implementer then looks at the standard, says, you know, there's some ambiguities, but I will code CSP to work this way, and I'm going to choose these defaults. Hopefully, some of these developers will talk to each other, right, implementers, and will actually choose the same defaults. Not always the case. The security architect then in a corporation says, yep, this is going to save us, and we have to use CSP. So absolutely, let's implement that. You have the network operator. For simplicity, right, you want to use defaults as much as possible. So like, yep, I'm going to use the defaults. The executive, right, they all care about being compliant. Hey, we're using CSP. Great, we're compliant, because that's what the compliance mandate says. And then the security researcher comes and says, you know, this corporation is really stupid because their use of CSP can be exploited. And the one word that I will say is heartbleed, right? Because it was fascinating. I've done security workshops for a very long time, and I used to always start with Crypto 101. Because I'd say, you know, cryptography is important. You have to really pay attention, or at least be knowledgeable that, you know, random number generators may not be the best, right? This means that you could have compromises in what you inherently believe to be trusted, right, your public-private keys. Or the fact that, you know, what are the defaults, right? There were some vendors that still had 768-bit keys for their IPsec defaults for way too many years. Right, so the reason that I loved Heartbleed was because everybody took a little snoozer while I was talking about crypto, and nobody really paid attention. All of a sudden, with Heartbleed, people are like, wow, I need to understand what my defaults are. Wow, I got to pay attention to like the different modes in crypto and, you know, what the key lengths should be. Now, yes, it's a pain in the butt. It's details that maybe some of us really wish would be better in defaults, but they're not. Right, so we live in a world right now where you do have to pay attention. You do need to know what your defaults are in your equipment. You do have to understand some of the ramifications. And, you know, one of the things that I really, really want everybody to be aware of is that all of these folks need to talk to each other. Right? This is why you also, in companies and in different environments, even in governments, you have cross-functional security teams so that everybody can understand each other's viewpoint and then figure out how to mitigate the risks in a better way. And, you know, we're in this world right now where we have so much data. When I was at TNC, it was so cool because these are research networks, and there was some really interesting research going on in Antarctica, you know, other in healthcare regimes, in whatever have you, to really make our world better. It's a lot of data. But then you have to think about where is that data going, right? And how is it getting secured? So while we want all of these new applications that, you know, track our health, we can know how many steps we take and, you know, whatever else have you. I mean, there's an app for almost everything. But really, we have to figure out, you know, how do people have access to this data, right? Who's authorized to have access? Is there any kind of access control? Is there integrity so that nobody can twiddle with the data in some way? And then there's the confidentiality aspect, and if I need to have access to the data, will I have access? And that also has to be balanced with privacy, human rights, right? In the UN, quite a few years ago, right, it was decreed that internet access is a basic human right. Then online privacy, as well as freedom of expression. And so it's a very, very complex thing that we're dealing with when we're looking at online security, right, security and privacy. And then everything's broken, right? How many of you actually track breaches? Right? I mean, it's kind of scary. Every time I give a talk, I put a slide like this on, and then I look at the latest breaches so that I can put in some newer headlines. And then I just shake my head and I'm like, okay, don't think about it. It's kind of like when I fly on an airplane and I think about the complexity of what goes into an airplane, right? It's the same thing. Like, I don't want to think about it because then I'll go nuts, right? But, you know, when I look online and I look at how broken everything is and how many breaches in every single sector, right? It's interesting, right? Because why is this happening? Right? There's a lot of people that care. There's good protocols out there. There's good equipment out there. Like, what is it? And yes, I know it only takes one, right, to actually do a breach. But sometimes they're not detected for 3 years, right? And it's really, it's an epidemic, right? And a lot of breaches are not even reported, or they're not seen in the news. And so it's very, very, very interesting times. And why are things so broken? Like, remember the trickle effect, right? Like, as I see today, too, people coming into the room, it's a trickle effect of people saying, oh yeah, I really do have to pay attention to this thing called security. But we've now reached the point where there's billions of new devices online, right? And as we're all aware, is that, you know, some of them don't even have the fundamental security basics that you can configure. They're not even implemented. And there's large amounts of bandwidth now available globally, right? I look at India. India is exploding in terms of getting online because there was an effort, you know, it took 10 years, but, you know, they built out the capacity and now they're making it very inexpensive for a lot of folks to get online. That's billions of people. Then the criminal sophistication, and this is what I'm going to touch upon much more on, is the criminals are getting network architecture clue, right? It used to just be endpoint devices. But in the last few years, they've gotten much, much smarter to actually utilize networks to do much more sophisticated attacks. So it's much harder to detect, and it causes a lot more impact. I attended some really great talks yesterday, right? There was one on DNS tunneling. I mean, there's much more tunneling going on for nefarious activity and also use of encryption. And of course, social media has been weaponized for quite a number of years, and the information that we put out there is sometimes fascinating to me. And then you have a lot more automation. So data sharing also has opportunities and risks, right? The opportunities are vast. So social media greatly simplifies sharing. I was on a panel, it was about 2005, about how social media is changing the security of companies, right? Because you're working for a company and you might be putting out on social media that, hey, yeah, really cool, I'm going to a conference or a meeting in London. And some people that are watching the industry might say, oh, they work for so-and-so company. I've heard rumors that there may be an acquisition. And, you know, because of the data that you're putting out there, people can piece together that, oh, yeah, there's talks going on. Right? So this has been going on for over 15 years. But the simplified sharing, people just love to put information out there without any thought of the consequences. And digitalization also enables sharing across many sectors, right? The banking sector, the healthcare sector, oil and energy, travel sector, what have you. And a lot of times it gives you time and cost savings and, of course, instant gratification, right? I love looking at my app and going, wait, what time do I fly again? Oh, where are my bags, right? Some of these airplane bags. So I know that, oh, yeah, my bag made it on the airplane, so when I arrive, I'll have it. Yay, I'm happy, right? But with all of this data, what are all the risks that are introduced? And I think with GDPR, I have a love-hate relationship with it, but what I really love about it is people had to start thinking about what data do we have and how do we protect it? And a lot of people found out that, wow, we're not really protecting it as well as we should. So who has the data? Where's the data going? What is done to protect the data? And how is the data getting abused, or what is the potential for abuse? So I do want to spend quite a bit of time talking about the fundamental building blocks, where we really need to think about how can we better protect ourselves and have better visibility before more damage is done. And so routing, the domain name system, the public key infrastructure, right? These are fundamental building blocks where we've had blind trust for a very long time. Also credential management, right? You create a key, you create a password, a private public key pair. Do you really think about the entire credential lifecycle management, right? In many environments, people don't. And then also think about what the humans are doing. And for me, I always think about a couple of things. For any security assessment I do, anything I look at, any new protocol, I'm thinking of, well, how do you establish identity? Because it has to be hard to impersonate. And also, how is identity actually validated, right, in any kind of scenario? And then, do you have integrity of data and confidentiality of data? Like, is that capability possible? Do you need to do it? And then a very important component is auditing, right? Who has seen the information and looking at early warnings, right? So in DNS, in the last few years, people have understood that if they start getting feeds for newly observed domains, right, and then see whether or not their reputation is good or bad, they can actually have some early warnings in terms of some potential malicious activity. Right? So there are capabilities around, it's just, are we utilizing them effectively? So this is where I get into some of the sophisticated infrastructure attacks. So this happened back in April 2018, and it was really interesting to me because it showed that by doing a routing hijack, that somebody was actually able to poison the DNS cache, and they were putting together how routing and DNS was working. And there's other such attacks also. This was just the most publicized attack, which happened to take over Ethereum cryptocurrency wallets. So basically, Amazon route prefixes were hijacked. So Amazon's Route 53 DNS traffic for the authoritative name servers were rerouted towards a malicious DNS server. So the malicious DNS authoritative server that was set up had a legitimate IP address due to the route hijack, right? So if you were looking to see whether or not your authoritative name server had changed IP addresses, right, you couldn't tell, right? You're staying under the radar. And then these malicious DNS authoritative servers sent DNS answers back that basically caused a cache poisoning because they pointed to malicious sites. And then the intent overall was to take over Ethereum cryptocurrency wallets. So I have a picture of this because sometimes a picture is much better. So the router on the left is the correct, let's say, Amazon one, where it announces a bunch of /23s, right? And then most routers, and this is the point I want to make, don't do filtering effectively. Okay, filtering has been around ever since the router was created, right? And there's been talks for 20 years about please do prefix filtering or AS filtering. And people still don't do that as much as they should. So what happens is that somebody, the router on the left, will hijack the route. They will send a more specific /24s. If you're not doing the correct filtering, you will just pass it on. And then everybody will utilize the traffic and redirects it to the router that hijacked the route. Now, some security folks have talked about, well, why don't you just send /24s everywhere, right? Because that'll solve the problem. And the routing people are like, are you nuts, right? Because you don't understand how a router works, right? And you're going to explode the router, I mean, because it doesn't have enough memory. And then start thinking about IPv6. What are you going to do? Have /64s everywhere? Right? I mean, that's not a solution. Right? So filtering will help. So we all have to work with each other. Right? I mean, the hierarchy in routing was created for a reason. And so rather than say, well, it's your problem, or it's your problem, or it's your problem, it's all of our problem. Right? So doing some prefix filtering will really help. And people really should pay attention to this. So, what happens now, you've got this route hijack, so then somebody will set up the malicious authoritative DNS server, right, with the right IP address. They will poison the recursive server to point to a malicious site, and then the victim client, when they ask the question, hey, how do I get to the Ethereum site, then the recursive DNS server will have the malicious site in its cache and say, hey, point to this malicious site. And I saw, it wasn't widely advertised or talked about in the news, but it happened in a banking environment also. Right, so this is not the only use case. This is just the one that was most widely, in the press. But this is happening today. And so the criminals are becoming very, very sophisticated in terms of how to stay under the radar, right? They've been doing that for decades. But we need to understand that, wow, they're really starting to understand network infrastructure and figuring out how to bypass even our current alarm systems. So as I mentioned, right, the basic route hijack would not have been possible if there had been effective BGP prefix filtering. So most environments do not filter effectively. And then there's also something that people are now starting to promote more and more, and I do hope that people are paying attention to this. If you're a security person and don't know about any routing security protocols, please do look them up and talk to the people in your environments that are doing routing. But RPKI, the Resource Public Key Infrastructure, does help mitigate routing hijacks as well. And I have a slide on that just to give a little bit of fundamentals in case some of you don't know it. And then also DNSSEC. Right? Now, the interesting thing about RPKI and DNSSEC is that they do rely on a public key infrastructure. And so you have to know that as well. Right? So all these things tie together. Remember what I said about technical silos. Right? You're the security people, so you know about certificates and RPKI and PKI infrastructures. You're the routing people, right? You're the DNS people, right? Even from a technical side, we all have to start communicating with each other because there's interdependencies. So when you're looking at what RPKI is, it provides for origin authentication. So basically, if it says that I am authorized with my ASN to route these prefixes. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail because I've got a lot more slides, but basically that's the premise. And then also in the Internet Society, right, because really people aren't doing the fundamentals to protect their routing infrastructures, they created something called MANRS. I know that myself and a few other people in this room were part of the early meetings on that. And so it's kind of a norm for internet service providers, right, to agree to help each other and protect the internet by paying attention to routing security norms. So one is to prevent propagation of incorrect routing information by doing BGP filtering, preventing traffic with spoofed source addresses by utilizing BCP38, which is an IETF standard for ingress filtering, and using something called also unicast reverse path forwarding. And then facilitating communication between network operators, which basically says, yes, I'm going to make sure that I have contact information for my upstream and downstream, and then also facilitating the validation of routing information by using RPKI. So the ISPs that have signed this manifesto, right, are the ones that are agreeing to actually implement these 4 norms. So it's a great, great initiative by ISOC. DNS, right? We've heard over the last 5 years, right, a lot of issues, actually 10 years, all of the reasons why DNS is used for nefarious activity. So this slide, I actually asked permission 2 years ago to use in another conference, and I love this slide because it really helps to lay out threats related to DNS. And we actually had a DNS SIG meeting yesterday. We're starting a DNS SIG I'm one of the co-chairs along with Carlos Alvarez. And there was a discussion about, well, how do you categorize DNS abuse? And I didn't want to preempt this, right? But I love this slide because it talks about DNS protocol attacks, DNS server attacks, and categorizes DNS abuse. Now, it's not a standard anywhere, but I would love to start proliferating this terminology. So with DNS protocol attacks, you have the man-in-the-middle attacks, DNS spoofing, DNS rebinding. DNS server attacks, you have server DDoS and DOSes, server hijacks, cache poisoning. And then under DNS abuse, you have a whole bunch of stuff, right? Which includes covert channels, malicious DNS tunneling, malicious domains and IPs, and what have you. But it's a really compendium to show you how much DNS is utilized for nefarious activity. And the folks that came up with that are from Georgia Tech, led by, and there was a paper that was written called Detecting Internet Abuse by Analyzing Passive DNS Traffic, right? But DNS is widely abused. And because of all the talks that I saw yesterday, and there's one today also, I think this community absolutely is aware of all the DNS issues that we have to pay attention to. And of course, why do criminals register domain names? Well, because it's very easy to do phishing and spam, right? Well, more phishing, right? It's phishing we care about, ransomware, because these are the ways that people start, or criminals start, with getting access to information where they can then do more sophisticated attacks. So basic hygiene, right? It's all about the basic building blocks. Now, none of these things are new, but this leads up to something else because there's more and more attacks that are also starting to utilize more sophistication within the DNS. And these are not new concepts. These concepts all deal with don't have faith sharing, right? Make sure that you have backups. If somebody's attacking this server, make sure that you have another server that can then take over. Make sure that you have access control because you want to limit the views. You want to monitor activity to see whether or not something changes. But as I talked about just earlier, right, even if you're monitoring authoritative name servers to see whether or not there's a new IP address, because that might be somebody trying to impersonate it, well, if it's the same IP address and you don't see a difference, then what? Right? So again, there's never one silver bullet, right? Security has to be done in layers. And going on further, right, you want to do auditing. You want to review the log files to make sure that nobody has unauthorized access. In an environment a few years ago, when I was a CISO, and we were starting to really look at, which logs do we want to start paying a lot of attention to, I thought about it for a while, and I said, my number one is unauthorized access attempts. That to me was primary. I mean, there's so many things that I needed to look at and pay attention to, but my primary one was unauthorized access attempts, because this gives me a way to see who's knocking on the door and who might be getting in, right? I mean, you guys might have some other perspectives, but to me, that was really, really critical. Yes, I wanted to make a point. So the very last bullet, I wrote it this way on purpose, because sometimes people use terms, and if you're not familiar with them and don't know what they're used for, then it gets a little bit convoluted. So this sentence, use techniques to assure authoritative answers come from expected source and that no one has been able to modify the answer in transit. I could have used one word. What would it have been? DNSSEC, exactly. So I always like to talk about what does it do, because if you talk to the executives and say, well, we have to use DNSSEC, they're like, whoa, right? I mean, what is that? It's like, so yeah, I mean, I just want to let them know that, look, there's techniques, right, where that the answer comes from the authoritative and nobody's modified it or can't spoof a cache. That makes sense to them. So that's not difficult, right? And so we have to remember that we need to create context around some of the technical stuff we speak about. All right. So I'm not going to go into what DNSSEC is because I'm looking at the timer here and there's still a lot of points I want to make. But DNSSEC is important, right? And there's another protocol, DANE, right, which also relies on DNSSEC. And so DNSSEC relies on you understanding public key infrastructure, right, and doing credential management. So there's a lot of interdependencies, and it starts with the building blocks. DNSSEC is a very, very important building block for securing DNS. And, you know, what are the criminals after, right? They're after information so that they can impersonate you, so they can create fraud, right? This is why they're going after the medical industry, the banking industry, your social media sites, right? There's so much phishing going on. Last year, I started getting phishing from 3 supposed individuals, right, that all look to be on the homeowner's board that I'm on. Well, it wasn't from them, right? I looked at the actual email address. I'm like, huh, some gobbledygook from, you know, whatever country, right, whatever top-level domain. But what was really interesting is that I've gotten, in the last 4 months, probably 20 of those phishing attacks, all different, right, all with different kind of links or documents that I'm supposedly, you know, supposed to click on, right, to infect my machine. But the names are the 3 other people that are on the homeowner's board. And I'm like, who did this research? And the other people got it as well. Right, and I told them right away, don't click on anything, send me the information, because I'm consolidating the information and sending it to law enforcement, right, because they might be building a bigger case on this. But it's interesting to me because they're targeting specific groups and people are doing the research, right? I mean, homeowners association board, what? Right? And really, it's starting to get to the layman, and they're really looking at groups of people, right, and being very clever in terms of the emails that they're creating. But this is what they're after. And so the thing that I've been on the bandwagon for 15 years is credential management, right? And I'm on the Security Advisory Council of ICANN. And we did a report about 3 years ago or so now, it was published, SAC 74, which talked about the life cycle of credential management. Because nobody, or very few people, I should say, are doing it effectively. And this is one way that many, many, many sophisticated attacks start, by getting access to credentials. And there's many ways that criminals get access to credentials, right? Being a victim of phishing attack. A laptop gets stolen and you haven't encrypted your device and you've got a file with credentials on there. Right? Use a password manager if you can. You always should be able to. Sharing your password with another person, right? It still happens, right? I've been on elevators and conferences. In the back of me, there's, you know, 2 people talking that, oh yeah, I need access to this. Oh, you know, I don't know my password, or, you know, whatever the excuse. And the guy's like, oh, just use mine, you know, username, password. I mean, I could very easily glance at the person's like badge and be like, oh, that company, oh, you know, maybe start some nefarious activity to see if I can log in somewhere, right? Airplanes. People still talk in airplanes or in restaurants about things like this. And I've been a witness. So sometimes, depending on my mood, I'm like, hello, do you want me to log in? Maybe I'll look at your AS number and your IP address or something. I'm like, oh, you're from so-and-so company, you know, you probably shouldn't be talking about what your passwords are, right? Or you should be doing 2-factor authentication. But anyway, so sending credentials in clear text emails, that still happens, by the way. And so sometimes there's a breach, and the very, very helpful customer service people, you know, want to renew the credentials in a really speedy way and want to send them an email, right? They're not stupid. They're just not experienced enough, okay? And this is where we have education to do, and we at least have to have a process in whatever environment you're in so that they know and they learn not to do that. And of course, unpatched security vulnerabilities are exploited, right? Again, the panel yesterday was excellent because you really do have to do the updates and patches as quickly as feasible. So this slide is a synopsis of good credential management practices. So whenever you're creating, changing, renewing credentials, you need to think about how are you distributing it, right? Are you integrity protecting it and keeping the credentials confidential if they need to be? How are you storing it, right? Is it integrity protected? Does it have confidentiality? Recovering, delegating or transferring, revoking, destroying. And a lot of times, right, these devices are awesome, right? But what people don't sometimes think about is that if they have credentials on here because they're logging into certain systems, right, do they automatically back these up to a cloud? A cloud is somebody else's computer, right? Somebody else who's running that computer, what kind of security mechanisms do they have to protect your data? I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying make sure that you understand how they protect that data. Right? So we have to understand exactly what's happening with our credentials. And we want to avoid surprises. So these are just a couple of things that I've come across where people are not paying attention. Configuration files that store passwords are shared secret in clear text, right? Even in routers. Like here's one example. I was in an environment, I was doing a security assessment, and I was looking at, I'm very familiar with Cisco, so Cisco router configs. And so I was saying, you know, why did you decide to do this? And they said, oh, well, because some smart person told us to. And I'm like, well, that smart person isn't so smart. Because for any of you that might know this, right, Cisco has this way of protecting secrets in their configuration files, where you say username password something or username secret something. If you use the keyword password, when you encrypt that using password service encryption command, it creates a bit shift. If you use username secret, so the keyword secret, it does an MD5 hash, right? And so you could use one or the other. I wish they'd get rid of the username password, because doing the bit shift is something that years ago was put out on the web, and the minute that they announced the functionality, it was reverse engineered in, I think, an hour. Right, and so you're not then, and you enable password, right? You could say enable password something or enable secret something. So if you're sending that configuration file with supposedly encrypted, confidential information, right, confidential credentials, then somebody could reverse engineer that really quickly. So you need to think about these things. All right. Validating identity, so crucial, right? I have made statements sometimes, and they're always taken out of context, that sometimes I don't care when somebody has my password, right? But if I had two-factor authentication, I have less of a risk of somebody trying to impersonate me because I have that second factor. So even if they have my password, they still need another piece of information before they can actually impersonate me. Right? Of course I care if somebody has my password. But my main point is that today, in this day and age, because there aren't better mechanisms available, we need to do multi-factor authentication. Absolutely. So here's another case. And this is still ongoing, but this is what started happening last fall. So an attacker gained access to a victim's registrar account, right? When you want a domain, you go and go to a registrar to then say, hey, let me buy Merike.com. And this was done by compromised login credentials. So the attacker then changed the DNS record, right, the A record, changed the IP address and the authoritative server, and pointed them to the attacker's servers. And then once the DNS zone content was changed, the attackers impersonated legitimate services hosted by the victim. And it gets more interesting. The attackers then executed a man-in-the-middle attack against users by generating fake X.509 certificates. So now we've got impersonated certificates in play. And certificates also is one of the main building blocks. Right? Years ago, I was involved in doing a security assessment of the 787 airplane. Okay, this was back in 2007. And I was looking at their PKI architecture and, you know, looking at how they do cross-certifications of airplanes and access to airplanes and what have you. And I'd never really looked that deeply into PKI before, and boy, did I get scared. Because there was a vendor that had a whole bunch of trusted roots in there, right? And I don't like to name and shame, so I'm pretty careful about this. But yeah, so we decided that we don't need all those roots, and we want to be more stringent, so we took them out. Well, the really sophisticated vendor decided that we probably didn't know what we were doing, that they were smarter than us, and they just automatically repopulated all the roots. Right? And it was really difficult to go into the bowels of, you know, the configurations to actually change this. Right? So after a while, you know, they changed that. It took about a year or two. And then I started looking at the different implementations. I'm like, this is so broken, it's not even funny. People were not validating what you're supposed to be validating in a certificate. Right? So you're supposed to look at the validity. And they weren't. Like, you know, they didn't even say that, oh, look, you know, it's a year later than the validity period, but the certificate is still valid. Why is that? Because the software is not checking it. Right? And it was awful. I mean, it was worse than awful. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? You know, and you started having, you know, SSL, TLS, everybody was depending on this, right, on the certificates, yet the software wasn't checking what it was supposed to be checking for. And this is, what, 12 years ago? Right? And I already started thinking, I'm like, I can either be depressed every single day of my life, or I can just slowly try and help and make change. Right? And it's all about education. So I see that I'm already in the red, and I've got a couple more points that I definitely want to make. So I'm not going to go into detail, but with certificates, right, again, this is what you're supposed to be checking on the right. You know, any software, I hope they do that. Right? And so how do you validate? I don't know, right? I mean, who has time to validate everything? But this is the responsibilities of the vendors. So it's getting better over time, but again, you know, you got to check your implementation at times. And so fundamental security. So why does fundamental security matter? This is a slide that I took by Jeffries, which is an identity theft resource center. Breaches are just increasing, increasing, increasing. This is from 2005 to 2017, and you know how they're increasing in businesses, medical environment, educational environment. There's a lot of universities getting attacked, other schools, governments, financials. And the thing is, as your privacy gets violated, as people get access to your PII, personal information, right? What are criminals doing with it? Extortion, bullying, embarrassment, financial ruin, identity theft, fraud, and it does lead to loss of life, right? With bullying, right? I think we've all seen in the news suicides that you know people have, and you know with the healthcare industry being attacked, right? There's absolutely loss of life that comes into the equation. So this is not just fun and games anymore, right? This is extremely serious, which is also why governments are getting involved. So we need to get back to the basics, right? To me, security is always about these points on the left. And I don't care what term a vendor makes up, I will go back to the basics. You know, any cute term, any fun term, right? I'll say, well, what are you actually doing? Oh, okay, this deals with integrity. Okay, this deals with access control, right? And then the most basic security controls minimize the impact of sophisticated attacks. Security is difficult because it's very detail-oriented, right? There's a lot to think about, a lot to do, but the sophistication comes in also because people are utilizing very simple ways to get access to credentials that then help create the more sophisticated attacks. So don't rely on defaults, limit fate sharing, use cryptographically protected protocols, right? And check your hashes when you're actually downloading any software, right? I know that I also sometimes get lazy, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I trust it. And then I'm like, oh, no, I really should check the hash. It'll take me, 30 extra seconds, maybe 60, right? But we have to be vigilant, and then get alerted for unauthorized changes. And we have to continue building trust in people, right? We want to build a culture that builds and maintains trust. I think most people are trustworthy. As we saw in the keynote yesterday, you don't know who's going to have any kind of nefarious agenda. But same is true in the physical world, right? A physical crime, you're like, wow, never thought that person would do that, right? It's the same in the virtual world. You want to create values that center around integrity and trust. Develop cultures of commitment. You guys are all committed. You came here this morning, right? I was joking earlier. I said, anybody that actually was at the social last night and didn't come this morning, if they click on the video to see this talk, I want to drink, right? Because I didn't drink last night because I'm on stage this morning. So you want to challenge a culture of blame. The blame game has to go away, right? The hype, it's their fault, they're dumb, they're stupid, right? We're all in this game together. Let's educate each other. Learn from incidents, and again, educate each other. And trust is always earned, but you have to verify, right? I might trust you today, I may not trust you tomorrow. So trust but verify, and remember, don't have blind trust in standards, frameworks, best practices, reference implementation, certifications, right? Do look at them on occasion, see whether or not they have to be changed, and then somehow we have to measure effectiveness over time. And that's it for today.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Merike. We've probably got time for one quick question, because we are on short coffee breaks today. Okay, I hope you're around today, or?
Yeah, I'll be around for a couple hours.
Oh, sorry. Somebody in a dark shirt in the back of the auditorium, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Sinu from Indonesia. How do you think about cryptography in the future? Because everyone needs speed in exchanging their data later. Because according to your presentation, cryptography has a limitation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. So I want to reiterate, cryptography is used for at least 3 things: integrity, non-repudiation, and confidentiality. I think cryptography is essential to secured communication. What I think we have to think about is where we need to have confidentiality. Because in my mind, integrity and non-repudiation and using cryptography is essential for all communications, all pieces of data. For confidentiality, you want to make a policy decision because you want to see whether or not you need to have visibility to the data for other reasons.
That's great, thank you. One note, we've spotted that there is a rather hideous clash between the Women of First BOF and the PC 2020 lunch. And since we don't want an all-male program committee, can you, no, really, we don't want an all-male program committee. Can you keep an eye on the BOF board downstairs, because the previously announced times may change. The last I have from Nora is we're on it. So, so thank you very much, Merike.